Okay, I'd like to start by reading a poem. Um, Poems are a bit long to actually remember, or I've written quite a lot of poems, so I don't remember them all. So you must forgive me for reading this. Poem's actually called Resilience. As tipping points pass, believing what is normal, grace under pressure, profound distractions, vanity of vanities, left to the market. On the ship of fools, singing deaf, dancing blind, now we're acting mad. Elite ignorance, inertia from white box brains, expert arrogance. In a complex world, leading a child by the hand, here under the sun. Not so much knowledge, living in a quantum world, a shift in thinking. Create and destroy the rhythm of Shiva's drum. Never stop dancing. Richness of life, you, to me, to them as one. This is all there is. As the globe warms, the other side of collapse, my tears taste of salt. So that was a poem that in fact I wrote for the Earth exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, which was their contribution to COP15 in December 2009. Life isn't simple. Again, we go around in our society pretending that life is simple. We look for Twitters, we look for sound bites, we try and make headlines. But actually, life is very complex. There are many different issues, and I believe I try and use my art to actually celebrate that complexity. It's related to the whole idea as well of biodiversity, of nature, of ecosystems, and looking at the relationships and the interrelationships of humans to all the other species and how all the other species relate to each other. So there is no thing of us and the environment. That's kind of somewhere else. We are the environment. We live with our environment. Working with the students, I encourage them to ask questions. I was aware that a lot of particularly architecture and engineering students are taught through problem-based, solution-led ways of design. That's fine in certain respects, and it encourages certainly a different kind of teaching that's not just about lecturing students in a university lecture hall. It's actually about students being able to go out and identify problems that they then, through the skills that they've obtained, be able to solve. Or at least that's the idea behind it. The issue here, however, is that this approach means that the world becomes a problem. And people from these particular disciplines believe that they've been given the skill set to go out and solve these problems. Very nice idea, and can be quite rewarding in certain respects. But this problematizing, this way of working with problems, this focus on problems and the solutions that they believe that they're able to offer, is actually a very narrowing process. It means it limits what you're actually able to see. It means quite often that the problem doesn't actually appear in its context, and therefore the problem has been isolated quite often from the very things that have actually brought the problem in the first place. I was working with some engineering students, and they brought this idea of problem-based learning to my art students. And the two students were like completely different cultures, different ways of thinking. The engineering students couldn't understand the processes that my students were actually using to address different situations. And I then understood that actually what my students were doing was from a question-based point of view rather than a problem-based point of view. So, this questioning, this way of approaching the world and simply questioning it, sometimes brings out problems. But it doesn't focus on the problem. It actually focuses on further questions. And so the issue that you might be looking at opens up because each question interrogates the issue further and further, deeper and deeper, rather than a problem approach which closes it down. So, in terms of the way that we engage the world, in terms of the way that we engage climate change, we can start to see how, instead of making climate change a problem and simply trying to solve the problem, if one starts to approach these issues as questions, one can then start to see the issue in its full context and can start to actually unpack the issue and start to work with different elements of the issue as a whole way of working, as a whole way of thinking. This particular image is of a very large reservoir north of London. It's actually part of the Lee Valley, and the Lee Valley, with the Lee River that runs through it, provides 10% of London's water. Now, this reservoir also provides, as you can see, a very nice facility for sailing and things of this sort. But the area around it is very highly industrialised, and the current series of governments from different parties, they all seem to have the same agenda, is to actually build as much as possible and raise extra finance from the development of this particular area. Not thinking at all about actually what they're doing to the ability to generate fresh water. Because again, with climate change, already in Britain, we're having a problem with water supplies. So what do? Build all over the water. So again, Greenhouse Britain started to look at the issue of fresh water and how sea level rises will reduce even further the amount of fresh water that's available to us. So instead of building on it, we decided that actually what needed to happen to generate fresh water was to grow forests. Forests are extremely good for both holding water. In fact, if you think of a forest, the trees in a forest as being a lake in the air, because they hold water. They hold carbon. So they're doing two things here at least. They pump oxygen back into the atmosphere during the day. So they're doing something else. So the whole idea of actually changing the place that we live can start to address some of the issues that we face. Needless to say, reforesting also greatly increases biodiversity, which we are desperate to do on this planet. These kind of futuristic eco-towers, as we nicknamed them, basically we were looking at, okay, if we're going to forest everything, where do people from London and from the London suburbs, where do they live? So each of these towers represented a small town or city. So we're looking at about 10,000 people living in each of these towers. Needless to say, design of these would include that each one of them was completely self-sufficient in rain water harvesting, in managing its own waste, in generating its own electricity, and in growing some of its food, because each floor within these towers would actually have its own gardens as well. So these are not finished, resolved solutions, but they are ways of posing further questions, asking people, about the way in which we're going to live, the way in which we're going to have to live, or change towards, perhaps, is a better way of putting it. Projects that I work on mostly don't have product. Very difficult for artists, even more difficult for curators and funders to actually understand that you have an artist making art, but you don't see anything at the end of the day. That's because the art is largely about the process. It's the way in which we do something. If you remember back to that word that I talked about, irrta, it was the dynamic process by which the whole cosmos continues to be created virtuously. So, I'm more interested in process, the way that things happen. When I'm talking about the project that I did, A Walk on the Wild Side, yes, there was a film made about it. Yes, that got shown in galleries. Yes, there were different publications. But the art actually took place on the walk. You can think of it more as a performance, I guess. But it's a process, and it was in the changing attitudes of the people. The way in which, for instance, school children from fairly poor neighbourhoods and fairly poor backgrounds could actually see the places in which they were living had life. In fact, there was one occasion when they discovered on a very, very cold, bright February afternoon, we came across a whole field where frogs had laid their spawn. And I mean, there must have been several million eggs across this field. And the kids, the youths, they were absolutely amazed that they'd never seen this. Some of them were initially disgusted by it, wanted to poke with a stick and all the rest of it. And that's about kind of discovering things as well. But it changed their attitude as to where they lived. Exploring the city of Manchester with these kind of walking processes also meant that people from different disciplines, I mentioned earlier about this idea of transdisciplinary ways of working or post-disciplinary ways of working. These walks facilitated people from different disciplines, botanists, ecologists, other types of scientists, community development people, people that represented the communities coming together, people that would not normally meet, and they would discover where they were living and how they were living in the city. So, for me, at the end of the day, the most important thing about my art, I think, is a quote that I use from Robert Pirsig's book, Leela, An Inquiry into Morals. And he says quite near the end of the book that the most moral act of all is making space for life to move onwards. Not making objects, but making the space for things to happen. Creating the habitat, creating the ways of thinking, creating the capacity for things to evolve and for life to emerge. So, thank you.